Some women don't conquer a man's heart. They haunt it, not because they beg to be remembered, but because they touch something in him that no one else dares to. They don't feed his ego. They awaken his unconscious. She was that kind of woman, quiet, observant, and terrifyingly still. Not the kind who entered his world with noise and light, but the kind whose presence made him see himself. When she looked at him, he felt naked, not in the way of flesh, but in the way of soul. Her gaze did not admire. It understood, and that was far more dangerous. In Jungian language, she was not just a woman. She was his anima, the embodiment of his unlived emotion, his buried longing, his forgotten tenderness. And though he could not name it, he felt it, that gravitational pull between her silence and his chaos. When they met, it wasn't fireworks. It was recognition. A subtle ache beneath the ribs. A faint whisper of something ancient that said, "We've been here before." She saw beyond his charm, past the armor he wore so effortlessly. While others praised his confidence, she saw the trembling boy behind it. While others adored his intellect, she heard the fear hiding between his words. And that is what undid him. He had spent years perfecting his persona, the carefully crafted image of strength and control. In Jung's terms, this was his mask, the version of himself designed to be admired, never questioned. But her presence dissolved it like smoke. Because she didn't respond to performance, she listened to the silence beneath it. There was something disarming about how she existed. She didn't chase. She didn't compete. She simply was. Like the moon, distant, quiet, and yet impossible to ignore. He found himself drawn to her without understanding why. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense. It was compulsion, a magnetic curiosity toward the part of himself she seemed to hold in her eyes. He wanted to possess her, to name her, to fit her into the familiar categories of romance. But she couldn't be contained in that way. She wasn't there to soothe him. She was there to mirror him. And mirrors, to the unconscious man, are unbearable. In her company, he began to feel emotions he couldn't control: envy, awe, tenderness, rage. All the things he had buried now rose to the surface, summoned by the reflection of his own soul, standing quietly before him. At first, he mistook this intensity for love. He called it passion, chemistry, fate. But what he really felt was a tremor of his shadow being seen. She didn't fall for the version of him he wanted to be. She connected with the parts he disowned, the sadness, the longing, the fear of inadequacy. And when she didn't flinch from them, something inside him cracked open. It was intoxicating, the way she could sit in silence with his darkness and not try to fix it. She didn't offer advice. She didn't demand more than he could give. She simply witnessed. And that was unbearable, because her understanding felt like exposure. He began to pull away. He told himself she was too intense, too deep, too much. But what he really meant was that she saw too clearly. She made him feel things he wasn't ready to feel. And the ego hates that kind of intimacy. In Jungian terms, this is where projection begins. He starts to see in her what he cannot face in himself. Her mystery becomes manipulation. Her stillness becomes indifference. Her boundaries become rejection. Because when a man has not integrated his own feminine, the emotional, the intuitive, the receptive, he will project it onto a woman, love her for it, and then resent her for holding it. She felt the shift long before he spoke it. The energy dimmed, the eyes wandered, the rhythm faltered. But she didn't chase, because she understood something he didn't. That love born from unconsciousness cannot last. It must either awaken or die. And so she allowed the space to open, not as punishment, but as truth. The connection that began in fire now dissolved into mist. He retreated into the safety of logic. She withdrew into the stillness of awareness. And between them, something eternal hummed, not an ending, but an initiation. He would move on, or at least he would try. He would seek women who were easier, who laughed at his stories, who didn't ask him to meet himself so completely. And yet, no matter where he went, a fragment of her would remain. Because once a man has been truly seen, he cannot unsee himself. Once his darkness has been understood, not judged, not fixed, but understood, no other gaze will ever feel the same. The world would call a heartbreak. but she would call it transformation. He would remember her in flashes, a scent, a song, a silence that felt like home. Not because she loved him more than the others, but because she touched the part of him that love alone could never reach. After she was gone, his world didn't collapse. It simply became quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but absence. An echo of something sacred that had once filled the space between his heartbeat and his breath. At first, he convinced himself he was fine, that he had moved on. He spoke her name less, erased her messages, told himself the story of every man who refuses to feel. She was beautiful, but complicated. She wanted too much. She wasn't right for me. But beneath those words lived a truth he dared not speak. He missed the way she made him see himself. In every room he entered after her, he found reflections of what he had lost. Women with laughter that rang hollow, conversations that skimmed the surface, kisses that felt like echoes. None of them mirrored him the way she did. None of them reached into that sacred darkness and stayed long enough to understand it. Because that's what she did. She didn't run from his shadow. She sat beside it unafraid, as if she'd known it all her life. And that frightened him more than any rejection could. For the first time, he began to understand what Jung meant when he wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Her absence began to direct him now. He saw her face in strangers, heard her voice in his dreams. Not because she haunted him, but because she had become the language of his inner world. She was not a woman anymore. She was an archetype, the sacred mirror of his anima, the feminine within him that longed to be known. Every memory of her became a message from that deeper self, a whisper calling him to descend, to enter the underworld of his own psyche, to find the parts he had long buried in ambition, success, and control. For a while, he resisted. He distracted himself with noise, new faces, endless work, sleepless nights. But the silence always returned. And in that silence, she waited not as a ghost, but as a truth. He began to see the pattern. How he used charm to escape vulnerability. How he mistook validation for intimacy. How he feared being truly seen. Because to be seen meant to surrender control. She had seen through all of that, and now her memory demanded he do the same. There were nights when he sat alone, staring at the ceiling, remembering how she once said nothing, and yet said everything. Her silence had been a mirror, too, one that showed him what words could never fix. He began to wonder, was it her he missed, or the version of himself he could only access in her presence? The answer came like a soft wound. He missed the wholeness she awakened, because that's what true connection does. It doesn't complete us. It reminds us of what was never lost. She had touched the divine feminine within him, the part that felt deeply, empathized, surrendered, created, the part that he had exiled in the name of masculinity. Now, without her, he could no longer hide from that exile. The shadow began to whisper, "Look at me. You cannot love her without learning to love me." And so, unwillingly, he began to descend, not into despair, but into integration. He started to face the anger that protected his fear, the pride that masked his tenderness, the shame that lived beneath his need to be desired. Each revelation felt like death, but also like rebirth. For this is what individuation demands, that a man must lose the woman who mirrors his soul, in order to meet that soul within himself. The journey was not noble or poetic at first. It was raw, lonely, and humiliating. The ego resists truth the way the skin resists flame. But slowly, he began to notice something changing. The silence that once felt empty now began to hum with presence. He could sit with his pain without drowning in it. He could listen to his emotions without labeling them weakness. And in that stillness, he began to understand what she had known all along. That love is not possession, it is recognition. He remembered how she used to look at him, not with longing, but with clarity, as if she had seen the storm inside him and decided not to run, not because she wanted to be consumed, but because she knew that storms cleanse as much as they destroy. She had never been trying to save him. She had only been showing him the map to himself, and he, blinded by his need to control the narrative, had mistaken guidance for danger, depth for difficulty, truth for threat. It took losing her to understand. The feminine that he feared was not her, but the one within. He began to write again, something he hadn't done in years. The words flowed not as confessions, but as conversations with the unseen parts of himself. He wrote of longing and shame, of power and surrender, of the quiet kind of love that doesn't demand, but simply knows. And in those words, he felt her again, not as a ghost, but as energy, not as memory, but as meaning. She had become his muse, yes, but also his mirror, and he realized perhaps that was her purpose all along. Some souls don't stay to love us in the ordinary sense. They arrive to awaken something that cannot be touched, only remembered. That is the paradox of such women. They break the illusion, not the heart. They leave, not because they stop caring, but because they refuse to stay where truth is unwelcome. He began to forgive himself, not for losing her, but for being too afraid to see what she saw. And as he did, her image softened in his mind. The ache became gratitude. The memory became lesson. The loss became liberation. He realized she was never asking him to choose her. She was asking him to choose himself. The self he abandoned long ago when he learned that feeling deeply was dangerous. Her love had been the invitation. Her departure was the initiation. Now, as he walked through the dim corridors of his own becoming, he began to notice beauty in the quiet. He began to feel a peace that wasn't dependent on her presence. Because when a man meets his own feminine, he no longer seeks salvation in another. He simply remembers. There's a moment, quiet and almost invisible, when the darkness begins to soften. It doesn't vanish. It simply changes shape. That's what began to happen to him. The pain that once burned like a wound now pulsed like a rhythm. Slow, alive, deliberate. It was no longer something to fight, but something to feel. And in that subtle surrender, a strange peace entered his life. He no longer reached for distractions. No endless scrolling through empty conversations. No chasing the echo of validation through other faces. Instead, he sat with his silence. He listened to it, and slowly, he began to hear something underneath. The faint hum of his soul returning home. For the first time, he began to see that what he had mistaken for love in the past was often just fear in disguise. Fear of being unseen. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being ordinary. But her love, her presence, had been something different. It had not flattered his ego. It had confronted it. It had asked him to grow, to soften, to see. And though he had lost her, the lesson she left behind remained like an eternal flame. Real connection does not demand completion. It awakens consciousness. He began to realize that all along, he had been chasing fragments of his own soul through women who could not carry the weight of his projection. Each one reflected back to him what he could not yet claim within himself. The nurturer, the mystery, the muse, the mirror. But she, the one who understood his darkness, had refused to carry those projections. She had loved him without illusion, without decoration. She had seen both his gold and his shadow, and she had not mistaken one for the other. And that was why he could never forget her. Because she did not feed his fantasy. She revealed his truth. In Jungian language, she had forced him to meet his Anima, not as a woman outside of him, but as the sacred feminine within. And that meeting, though painful, was the beginning of wholeness. Now, as he sat in that quiet room, the same room where her laughter had once filled the air, he no longer felt haunted. He felt held by something unseen, something ancient, the same energy she had carried with such effortless grace. That was the beginning of his integration. The masculine no longer needed to dominate. The feminine within him no longer needed to hide. Together, they began to dance, the dance of light and shadow. It changed the way he looked at the world. Where once he saw threats, he now saw invitations. Where once he saw loss, he now saw initiation. He began to treat life itself as a conversation between opposites. Pain and peace, chaos and stillness, desire and detachment. He started speaking less and listening more, not just to others, but to the quiet intelligence moving through his own emotions. And somewhere, in a different city, under a different sky. She felt that shift, because energy never dies. It simply changes direction. The woman who had once understood his darkness no longer waited for his transformation. She had released it long ago. But something deep in her chest, that quiet intuition that speaks in whispers, felt his awakening. She was no longer the woman who carried his potential. She was a woman who had chosen her own. Her days had become softer. She had stopped explaining herself, stopped trying to convince the world that her depth was not too much. She had learned to sit with her own mystery, the same mystery that had once frightened him. And in that stillness, she discovered the power of detachment, not the cold, cynical kind, but the divine detachment of a woman who has learned to stay connected to herself even in the presence of love. She no longer needed him to return. She no longer needed closure or apology. Her closure was in the knowing that she had been true. She had loved without losing herself. And that, she realized, was the rarest kind of power. Yet sometimes, in dreams and moments between waking and sleep, she felt his presence again. Not as longing, but as energy, as a mirror reflecting the path they had both chosen to walk separately. She saw him standing on the threshold of his own rebirth, and in her heart there was no bitterness, only reverence, because now she understood something she could never have known before. When a woman understands a man's darkness, she doesn't bind him, she frees him, and in freeing him, she frees herself. The story between them had never been about romance. It had been about returning to the soul. They were never meant to end up together. They were meant to awaken one another. And so, in her own quiet way, she began to bless him from afar, not with words, not with messages, but with energy, the kind that travels beyond time and form. In her meditation, she whispered into the void, "May you see what I saw. May you love what you once feared. May you become a man who no longer runs from his own depth." And somewhere in the stillness of his night, he felt it. A wave of peace washed through him, as if forgiveness had found him without needing to be spoken. He closed his eyes and saw her, not as she was, but as she had always been, a mirror of the divine feminine, a guide, a soul who carried truth in her silence. And for the first time, he didn't ache. He simply smiled, because he understood. Love doesn't always return to the same form. Sometimes it becomes a bridge between two awakenings. She had become his teacher, and he, without realizing, had become hers. They had both met their shadows and survived, and that was enough. As dawn broke across the horizon, he stood by the window, feeling the morning light on his skin. There was no longing now, only gratitude. He whispered, not to her, but to the unseen connection that still lingered between them. "Thank you for showing me myself." And in that whisper, the circle closed. The masculine and feminine, no longer in conflict, now rested in harmony within him. The Anima and Animus finally reconciled, the dance of light and shadow complete. There comes a time when a woman no longer looks back, not out of pride, not out of anger, but because something inside her finally settles. The storm that once raged within her heart becomes still, like the surface of a moonlit lake. And in that stillness, she remembers who she is. She is not the echo of his confusion. She is not the medicine for his shadow. She is not the place he goes to hide from himself. She is the mirror that once revealed him, and now she turns that mirror toward the light. Her energy, once scattered across memories and apologies, begins to return home. Every thought that once reached for him now roots deeper into herself. Every heartbeat that once waited becomes its own rhythm again. This is the silent alchemy of awakening, when a woman stops explaining her worth to those who were never ready to see it. The world around her doesn't notice at first. She still walks the same streets, drinks from the same cup, speaks with the same softness. But something has shifted in her field, an invisible sovereignty. It is the power that comes when a woman has danced with darkness and chosen not to be consumed. Once, she would have begged to be understood. Now, she understands herself, and that is enough. Her love no longer seeks a direction. It simply radiates, like sunlight that doesn't ask where it falls. She has stopped needing to prove that her empathy wasn't weakness. She knows now that it was her strength, the divine kind that few can meet without trembling. In Jungian language, she has reclaimed her Anima's wholeness. She is no longer split between the lover and the healer, between the nurturer and the rebel. She has integrated all her aspects, the soft and the wild, the light and the void. When she speaks now, her voice carries gravity, not the weight of sorrow, but the depth of someone who has known both illusion and truth. She no longer fills silences. She lets them breathe, and in that silence, the world bends toward her. Men sense her energy before they see her face. They feel the calm within her as something sacred, both invitation and boundary. Because she no longer chases, her presence becomes magnetic. She does not perform mystery. She is mystery. Because she no longer explains her depth, others must feel it. This is the paradox of feminine power. The less she gives to be understood, the more she is felt in every room she enters. There will be men who still think of her, not because of her beauty, but because of what she awakened in them. They will remember the silence between her words. They will remember the way she looked at them, not as objects of desire, but as souls waiting to wake up. Some will try to return, thinking they can reignite what once was. But what once was is gone. She has transcended that version of herself, and the world she left behind feels like an old dream. Now, she walks with a kind of serenity that cannot be taught. It is born only from breaking open and rebuilding in truth. There are days she still feels echoes of her past, but they no longer pull her backward. They remind her of her evolution. Once, she believed her love could heal him. Now, she knows her love was never meant to heal someone else. It was meant to reveal her capacity to love without losing herself. This realization does not come with fireworks or fanfare. It arrives quietly in small moments. When she wakes up and no longer checks her phone. When she looks in the mirror and sees peace instead of performance. When she realizes she hasn't thought of him in days, and the thought no longer hurts. She has entered the sacred space beyond attachment, the realm where the feminine becomes sovereign. In that space, she does not wait for apology or validation. She simply breathes. She simply is. It's the kind of freedom that glows beneath the skin, invisible to those who seek drama, but radiant to those who seek truth. This is what Jung called individuation. The soul's return to itself after walking through projection, illusion, and shadow. She no longer plays a rescuer in anyone's story. She no longer bends to fit the shapes of others' insecurities. She no longer confuses chemistry with connection. Instead, she honors the pull of her intuition, the rhythm of her boundaries, the language of her silence. And in that alignment, life begins to meet her differently. New energies appear, not the half-formed lovers who needed saving, but the conscious men who recognize the sacred in her stillness. They do not approach her as a mystery to solve, but as a force to respect. They do not chase her love. They rise to meet it. And yet, she does not wait for them either, because her wholeness is not a performance for the world to witness. It is her private temple, her quiet knowing that she is complete. Sometimes, when the night is long and the world feels vast, she still remembers the man who once stirred her shadow, not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because he was the door that led her inward. Without his confusion, she might never have met her clarity. Without his absence, she might never have learned the fullness of her own presence. And so, she blesses him, not as the one she lost, but as the catalyst who pushed her toward her light. Every woman carries such a story, of loving someone who could not yet see her, of trying to speak a language the other was not ready to hear, of finally realizing that the silence that follows is not emptiness, it is freedom. For in that silence, she becomes her own voice again. She walks now through the world like poetry in motion, her boundaries lined with grace, her presence rich with mystery. The world still tries to define her, but she no longer fits into definitions. She has become an archetype unto herself, the awakened feminine. Her beauty is not in her appearance. It is in her awareness. It is in the way she no longer needs to be chosen, because she already chooses herself. This is the quiet revolution that happens when a woman stops giving her energy to what doesn't see her worth. It is a reclamation of life force. It is a return of her essence. And for the man who once knew her, the man who now drifts between memories, she remains unforgettable. Not because she loved him with devotion, but because she saw him in his darkness and did not flinch. She met his shadow with compassion, not fear. She held the mirror to his soul without judgment. She offered him truth, not illusion. And though he could not stay, her understanding became the seed of his transformation. He may go on to find others, lighter, easier, less reflective, but somewhere deep within him, she remains. Not as a fantasy, not as regret, but as a quiet ache of having once been seen completely. And that, she knows, is her legacy. Because to understand a man's darkness is to awaken his light, and to walk away in silence is to remind him that love is not ownership. It is reflection. She was never his possession. She was his mirror. And when mirrors leave, they do not vanish. They return to the source that made them shine. So she walks on, through morning light, through quiet evenings, through the unspoken poetry of her own becoming. Each step is a prayer, each breath a boundary, each glance a revelation. She no longer needs a world to understand her story, because she has already lived it, felt it, and let it go. She is the woman he can't forget. Not because she loved him, but because she understood his darkness. And in doing so, she illuminated her own. And as the final echo of that love fades into silence, a truth rises like dawn across her soul. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak. She simply sees more.